Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of Season 8 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Howdy doody, Ray.
Oh, very nice. Now, Graham, we've most recently put out 2 episodes covering NatWest and the story of their relationship with Fowler Oldfield, but we're not quite ready to move on from NatWest entirely.
No, because while we were all still trying to absorb the ramifications of the NatWest case, the FCA last month issued a decision notice against HSBC, which ironically served to echo some key messages from the NatWest affair.
Now, you say ironically, Graham, and you use your words carefully normally, so can you explain that, please?
Of course, Ray. On the face of it, these are very different actions by the regulator. NatWest was prosecuted and a criminal fine was levied for its actions in relation to a specific customer. HSBC's penalty is a civil one. There's no criminal prosecution, and rather than focusing on one customer relationship, it looked at the entire aspect of the bank's AFC framework, its transaction monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, these were worlds apart, and yet there are some striking similarities in what the 2 papers reveal about the state of the 2 banks' respective systems and controls.
Yeah, and by the 2 papers, we should explain that our analysis is based on a close reading of the NatWest Statement of Facts and the HSBC Decision Notice, both published on the FCA website. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Graham. We've pored over them, so our listeners don't necessarily need to, although there is a lot to be said for it.
Yes, we can't hope to pack everything into the medium of this podcast. You'll get the main thrust of it, you'll hear some eye-opening details and examples, hopefully some insightful analysis.
That'd be
but
nice.
We try. But there is so much detail in the papers that they reward a full read by anyone, I'd say, who has any responsibility for a regulated firm's AFC systems and controls.
Yeah, that said though, we'll happily do our best to give the short version.
So we will, Ray, so we will. But I feel we've got a good handle on what was going on with NatWest's transaction monitoring in the 2010s, thanks to the Statement of Facts. They had in place electronic transaction monitoring that was alerting based on rules and scenarios. These had some issues like incorrect data, cash being logged as checks, for instance, a whole lot of risks and typologies that weren't covered by the rules, and often rules that would be suppressed or switched off when they generated too many alerts to handle.
Yeah, because alerts would each need human intervention to decide whether further review or action was needed.
Yes, that is right. We also know that there were a number of internal and external reports that put NatWest on notice that aspects of its transaction monitoring needed attention which in many instances took quite a while to produce implemented action and didn't necessarily solve the problems.
Now, I think that's a fair summary, Graham.
So, what was the situation during the same period at HSBC? Do we know?
We do, Graham. Because the decision notice covers the period from March 2010 to March 2018. And during that period, let's tick some of these off, HSBC had in place electronic transaction monitoring, check, that was alerting based on rules and scenarios, check. These had some issues like incorrect data, no distinction between cash and checks, for instance, tick, and a whole lot of risks and typologies that weren't covered by the rules, tick, and often rules that would be suppressed when they generated too many alerts to handle, tick. There were a number of internal and external reports that put HSBC on notice that aspects of its transaction monitoring needed attention, tick, attention which in many instances took quite a while to produce implemented action, tick, and didn't necessarily solve the problems. Full house, Graham.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm just looking for similarities here, Ray, but they do sound quite similar.
Yeah, quite strikingly similar, I would say. Shall we look at the HSBC findings in a little more detail?
Well, Ray, I think we should.
There are lengthy descriptions of the key transaction monitoring systems and rule sets in HSBC over the period 2010 to 2018 in the notice.
And at times it is a bit of an acronym soup, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is, but I think we can summarise in simple terms the findings here and separate out the different things that HSBC got wrong.
Well, Ray, I'm happy to begin. Although HSBC had very clear guidance they had created themselves to the effect that scenarios needed to be reviewed annually, this wasn't followed. The report notes they didn't have policies and procedures to drive it and often didn't have the expertise to easily understand the system. That guidance also said they shouldn't just rely on the established scenarios too, but the particular system had been in place for 12 years before any new scenarios were added.
Then, when new scenarios were added in 2016 and they got an entirely new system in 2017, HSBC didn't have policies and procedures to ensure proper risk assessments for the scenarios.
And what might be the impact of that, Ray?
Well, Graham, if the scenarios aren't underpinned by risk assessments, then you don't know whether they're actually addressing the risks of financial crime they're supposed to be covering.
OK, so they might not be alerting on the right things or not all of the right things.
Yes, which will have exacerbated the next finding, which is that from 2016 to 2018, something like 35% of the alerts from one particular scenario weren't reviewed for more than 90 days.
OK, let me just stop you there, Ray, and ask you, what is the significance of 90 days?
Well, that's the limit of the acceptable time for review to have been completed.
And who set that limit?
HSBC themselves, Graham. Until 2016, they'd set it at 67 days, but they increased it to 90 then.
As the FCA notes, alerts that are long outstanding like this can delay the identification of potentially suspicious transactions and hamper law enforcement efforts.
Well, indeed.
So, which particular scenario was it that was the source of this particular backlog, Ray?
The LRT scenario, Graham. Large, reportable transactions.
Oh. See, that doesn't sound very good.
No, indeed. The other scenario that's called out as causing backlogs and delaying potential reporting is the structuring scenario.
Now that again is a time-sensitive one, isn't it? I mean, we're talking here about the activity of breaking a large transaction down into smaller parts, possibly to avoid the attention a large transaction might otherwise get. I mean, a large reportable transaction, for instance.
Well, yeah. I mean, for these two scenarios together to be producing alerts that were reviewed late, for me represents quite an unfortunate confluence of related risks because they both look for current instances of what we sometimes call layering. If you can catch that quickly enough, there's a much better chance of a good law enforcement outcome than if by the time you report it, the trail has become obscured by many more transfers.
Well, yes, I think that is a fair analysis. There's talk in the report of reviewing and tuning thresholds as well as scenarios. Thresholds are also called limits, and they drive the level at which certain transactions or events alert if they're above the line or are suppressed if they're below the line.
Yeah, so self-evidently, where you set those thresholds can have a massive impact on your false positive and false negative ratios. Set the threshold low and you'll have lots and lots of false positives that you have to discount. Set it too high and you risk suppressing things that really would have concerned you had they come to your attention.
It's like setting the lawnmower blades, Ray, I always think.
Really, Graham?
Well, yes, in a grassy sort of way. If you set the blades too low to the ground and you have to keep stopping to empty all the cuttings out the grass box, and that's not much fun. But then if the blades are too high, so you're not cutting very much, you're also not getting the nice lawn surface you wanted. Set them very high and you won't even catch the daisy heads that are spoiling the whole look of the garden in the first place.
Very good, Graham. So adjusting the blades, reviewing and tuning the thresholds, ought to be a regular exercise.
Yes, HSBC's own guide said it should happen annually.
And did that happen, Graham?
Well, apparently not, Ray, or at least thresholds were seldom updated, and HSBC didn't have a defined process or documentation for the tuning job until 2016, that is.
And what happened in 2016?
Well, in the wider world, it was a pretty tumultuous year, wasn't it? David Bowie died, which is probably the most important thing. We had a Brexit referendum result, which appeared to surprise everybody, and the US elected a certain Mr. Trump as its president. And alongside all of that, HSBC reviewed and reset its thresholds.
Well, a big year indeed. Did this go well? The HSBC bit. I know how the rest of it went.
Talk to me about Trump. According to the FCA, no. They note that HSBC spent only a week doing it, leaving little opportunity to look at the effectiveness of the new thresholds, nor to ensure they were properly risk sensitive. And this latter point about risk sensitivity checking is something the notice says HSBC never did.
And that's something we know the regulators think is a cornerstone of a proper AML framework. Firms have limited resources and have to prioritise those customers and transactions they've identified as high risk. If it's all the same, they're wasting resources on the one hand and then not having enough left where it really matters.
That's absolutely right, and so often got wrong. And the report also notes that this hurried tuning exercise brought outcomes that meant that the 90-day timescales came under more pressure.
And they made one other schoolboy error in their tuning, Graham.
Oh?
Well, yeah. When they introduced a new system to monitor transactions in their correspondent banking relationships, they set the thresholds based on the projected volumes of alerts they would produce in each customer segment. There was no documentation or justification of how this was appropriate to the risks they faced, and of course could hardly have proved risk sensitive.
Of course. We're nearly finished now, aren't we?
Well, not too far to go, Graham. But the next one is a biggie. HSBC failed to carry out any testing throughout this period, either of the alerts that were being generated or of transactions that didn't generate an alert.
Now that is astonishing, Ray. So no above-the-line testing, and neither did they test below the line.
That's right, but it might be worth defining those terms. This comes out of the thresholds piece. Above the threshold or above the line, you'll get an alert. Below it, you won't. Above the line testing means reviewing systematically the alerts generated as a whole and checking those alerts are revealing issues that, on investigation, proved actually indicative of financial crime.
Yeah, you might think of that as checking that the lawnmower is actually cutting any grass at all.
Well, yeah, I suppose you might. But then that's only part of the story, because unless you do below the line testing, look at a sample of those that didn't alert because they were under the limit, you won't have any insight into what you might be missing.
So you're cutting the grass in the dark and can't see that the lawnmower is still too long and messy.
I think this analogy has done enough heavy lifting now, Graham.
All right, let's put it out to grass.
Now, that's what they call in the trade a tumbleweed pause. Now, well, okay, moving on. There's a couple of really good examples in the notice of how below-the-line checking could have found flaws in what the FCA called extreme thresholds.
You are having to go on and explain that, right?
Yeah, okay. So there was a change in behaviour scenario that applied to millions of customers across HSBC. That meant a customer needed a 500,000% increase or a 5,000 times increase in their yearly peak transactional activity to trigger an alert.
Well, you did say it was extreme.
Yeah.
That does seem, well, high, to say the least. There's another that meant that a low-risk retail customer who had a medium to high activity level needed their monthly debit activity to increase by 791,900%, or almost 8,000 times, over the preceding 12 months to trigger an alert. The FCA notes that these customers, they note this somewhat dryly, I think, who typically spent £19,322 per month, would have needed to spend over £153 million a month to trigger an alert.
Yeah. And finally, there's what we might collectively think of as the blind spots that were allowed to develop.
Well, that doesn't sound good. So what were they?
Well, there was a time when one rule in the system was erroneously suppressing all alerts in Wales. HSBC didn't keep a list of correspondent banking relationships, so not all relevant correspondent banking data was being fed into the systems either.
So they weren't monitoring a chunk of their correspondent banking transactions?
And that's about the size of it. And more broadly, the report concludes that HSBC failed to check the completeness and accuracy of the data that was being fed into systems throughout the period, despite a number of external parties warning them about this over quite a long period of time.
Oh, and the old saw of garbage in, garbage out is as relevant still as it always has been. How big were these blind spots?
Big, Graham. A couple of examples the notice gives are these ones. 26.1 million transactions with a total value of £46.3 trillion from two source systems were not monitored effectively due to data issues that meant the incorrect counterparty was being monitored. And then a high-value feed didn't correctly identify HSBC's role in the payment chain for 2.9 million transactions, totalling £16.6 trillion, fed into the transaction monitoring system, which meant that the correspondent banking transactions were being recognised as non-correspondent banking transactions, resulting in completely the incorrect counterparty being monitored for each transaction.
Yeah, and that's leaving aside for now the issue of Wales.
Well, quite.
Is there any insight into some of the criminality that was being missed through all of this?
Yes, the FCA illustrates the problems using several case studies. There's one they refer to as Customer A. Now, this is a company director with an annual income of £40,000, an expected net monthly income of £1,500, and monthly outgoings of £500. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs investigated him and found that between 2009 and 2011, Customer A had a leading role in a criminal gang involved in an attempt to steal several £1 million by setting up fake construction companies. In May 2014, he pleaded guilty to VAT fraud and received a custodial sentence.
Fake companies, Ray. I can't believe it.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah. Who would set up fake companies? Anyway, that doesn't sound entirely like it's HSBC's fault, Ray.
Well, no, I agree. But while he was engaged in this crime, HSBC did not identify certain unusual activity.
You'll need to tell me what that was now.
OK, well, in April 2010, Customer A received 18 payments totalling £127,000. 16 payments were received on a single day in mid-April and totalled £120,000 on their own.
That doesn't match his expected income and outgoings at all, does it?
No, Graham. Also, these payments were all round number transactions, and HSBC didn't identify that it needed to monitor round figure payments until 2014. Customer A's transactions were made up of 8 payments of £10,000 and 8 payments of £5,000.
Yeah, that sounds awfully like structuring or smurfing, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it wasn't detected for this or presumably other customers. The notice lists a whole series of other anomalous transactions in Customer A's account as well.
Is there a Customer B?
Well, yes, Graham, there is. On the 4th of February 2010, Customer B opened a savings account with HSBC and declared at the time a gross annual income of £81,851. Very precise, isn't it?
Very.
On the 16th of February 2010, so less than 2 weeks later, there were 5 separate payments made from Customer B's account, each of £9,832.32. A total of £49,151 in a single day.
Do you know, I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that is quite anomalous given the expectations they received 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah, I was going to say they're quite fresh expectations, aren't they? Yeah, there was no alert though, Graham. In May 2010, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs issued a production order requesting all documentation relating to Customer B's accounts for the period covering June 2007 to May 2010. Customer B was arrested in June 2010 for involvement in an operation to smuggle cigarettes into the UK, and in February 2012 he went to prison.
Game over then.
Well, not quite, no. Customer B was subsequently ordered in July 2013 to pay £1.2 million to HMRC or face a further 4 years in prison. And from July 2014 until the account was closed in March 2017, there was a sustained period of unusual activity of both incoming and outgoing transactions outside of that expected on the account. But no transaction monitoring alerts were triggered for this imprisoned customer. And to show how unusual these transactions were, the FCA show a graph on page 17 of the notice that is quite eye-opening.
And I hesitate to ask, but is there a customer C?
Well, I'm glad you asked me, Graham. Customer C was categorised by HSBC as a low-risk rated customer who had an annual income of £100,000 in 2006. Customer C made a number of large and unusual transactions in 2008 and 2009.
OK, that can happen.
Yeah, but before that, HSBC had been put on notice of a freezing injunction over the entirety of his assets and accounts, and this had triggered an internal request to inhibit his accounts.
Low risk, you say, Ray?
Well, yes, so it would seem. The transactions that went through, nevertheless, included in September 2008 over £27,000 paid into Customer C's accounts and over £54,000 paid out. In March 2009, over £154,000 paid into the accounts and over £202,000 paid out.
Wow.
Yeah, and then in June 2009 there was over £55,000 paid into his accounts and over £110,000 paid out. A couple of months later, in comes another £162,000 and another £137,000 paid out.
So isn't this the case where the system did actually raise alerts?
Yes. 4 transaction alerts appear to have been generated during 2008 and 2009, but all of these alerts were suppressed by other system rules and not investigated. Now, Customer C was subsequently placed on the UK Disqualified Directors Register in March 2011 and jailed for 6 years in October 2016 for fraudulently claiming over £4.7 million in VAT repayments.
OK, that's not a shining example of best practice then.
Well, not entirely, Graham, no, which brings us exactly to that, best practice. What can we learn from the very similar criticisms that NatWest and HSBC have faced of their transaction monitoring systems?
Well, you know, Ray, I have given this a lot of thought, and I think we can distill it down to 3 key issues, which I'm going to refer to as the lesson of the Danish king, the lesson of the thirsty aspidistra, and the lesson of the lazy cleaner.
Well, I think I can see where you're going with those, Graham. Let's start with the Danish king then. This is Canute, is it?
Yes, it is. A very much misunderstood version. Yeah. But I'm thinking of the popular version of the story where Canute sits on his throne on the beach with the incoming tide before him and loudly proclaims that the tide must stop and turn back.
It doesn't, of course, because just because you decree a thing must happen, even if you're a king, that doesn't mean it will, right?
Yes. And here I'm thinking of the policy that both banks had in place that directed proper reviews and governance around the rules and scenarios that the systems relied on. But it's not enough just to set that as a commitment without putting in place the procedures and resources that will allow it to happen and making sure that it actually does.
Wise words, Graham. What's all this about a thirsty aspidistra then?
Well, could be any houseplant really, but aspidistra is just a nice word, isn't it?
It's a lovely word.
And you need to keep them flying. The thing they all have in common is that buying them isn't enough. If they are to thrive, or even if they're to stay alive, they need regular care and oversight. They need to be watered, and they need to have plant food and nurtured. They need potentially to have special care in certain months when the temperature is either very high or low, or the air is dry. Pay them no attention and they will wither before very long.
And you can apply this to your automated systems. Having spent millions buying a system, it would be lovely to think, great, job done. But in reality, the work is just starting. You have to tweak and tune the rules, scenarios and thresholds to your own particular unique set of risks, and continually keep an eye on how those are changing and what the system needs to do to change so as to maintain coverage.
You've got it. And then there's the lazy cleaner. He decides that having run a hoover over the rug, everything is now fine.
While beneath the rug, all sorts of nasty stuff is festering and storing up eventual hygiene crises.
Yes. You have to lift the rug, Ray, particularly if you suffer from allergies. It's important. You can't determine how effective an alerting system is just by looking above the line, looking at what is alerted. You have to look at what doesn't alert too.
Amazing, Graham. And hopefully the lessons of the Danish king, the thirsty aspidistra and the lazy cleaner will be learned.
I hope so, Ray.
So, what's next for us, Graham?
Well, do you know, we have spent quite a lot of time now looking at the legal and regulatory side of financial crime. I thought it was time that we switched roles and spent an episode or two pretending to be villains and thinking like them as well.
Ooh, I'm looking forward to it.